I want to tell you about something that bothered me for a long time. When I was a kid, maybe 12, 13, my father used to take me on walks in the woods near our house in Far Rockaway, and he had this wonderful habit of never letting me get away with just the name of something. I'd point at a bird and say, "Hey, what's that bird called?" And he'd tell me the name, and then he'd say, "Now, do you know anything about that bird?" And I'd say, "Well, I know its name." And he'd say, "No, knowing the name is not knowing the thing. You know what people call it? You don't know what it is." And then he'd tell me about the bird, where it migrated, how it found food, what happened in its nervous system when it decided to fly. And by the end, I understood something real, not just a label, but an actual piece of how the world worked. My father gave me the most important intellectual gift I ever received. He taught me the difference between knowing something and knowing the name of something. I have thought about that distinction my entire career. It is, I think, the most important distinction in all of science, and it is the exact distinction that religion, in almost every form I have ever encountered it, consistently refuses to make. When you ask a religious person why the universe exists, they say God created it. When you ask why there is suffering in the world, they say it is part of God's plan. When you ask how prayer works, they say God listens and responds in his wisdom. These are answers. They have the grammatical structure of answers. They contain the word God, which functions as a noun, suggesting that something with definable properties is being referred to. But here's what bothers me. What is God? I don't mean what do people call God. I mean, what is the actual thing? What are its properties? How does it interact with the physical world? By what mechanism does it receive a prayer and adjust the state of matter and energy in response? Because the moment you start asking those questions, the moment you require the answer to have the same kind of content that any other answer in science or philosophy has to have, something very strange happens to the God concept. It starts to fall apart. And I want to show you exactly how, step by step, with no sleight of hand. Now, before I do that, I want to say something I mean genuinely. I am not trying to upset anyone. I'm really not. Some of the people I've loved most in my life had deep religious faith, and I respected that completely. My wife Gwyneth had her own quiet faith. My father, who taught me everything I know about thinking carefully, never pushed me toward or away from religion. He just pushed me toward honesty. So what I'm about to do is not a demolition job. I have no interest in demolition. What I'm going to do is follow the logic, because that's what I do. That's the only thing I know how to do really well. And the logic, when you follow it without flinching, leads somewhere that I find genuinely surprising, not comfortably surprising, uncomfortably surprising. The way a calculation that keeps giving you a wrong answer is surprising. You keep checking, you keep trying different approaches, you keep looking for the error, and eventually you have to accept that there isn't one. I'm going to take you through 4 problems, not arguments against religion in the political or social sense. 4 specific logical and physical problems with the God concept itself, with the actual structure of what God is supposed to be. Each one is a puzzle. Each one is the kind of thing I genuinely tried to think my way around before accepting that I couldn't. Let's go. The first problem is actually the most fundamental, and it's the one that almost nobody notices because it hides in plain sight. You cannot evaluate a claim until you know what the claim is. Sounds obvious, right? But try applying that to God. Ask 10 deeply religious people to define God, not describe their experience of God, not tell you what God means to them. Define God. Give you a description precise enough that you could, in principle, test whether something meeting that description exists. You will get 10 different answers. You will get answers that contradict each other. You will get answers that are explicitly designed to resist any possible test. God is beyond definition. God transcends human categories. To define God is to limit God. And here's the thing about that last type of answer. It sounds humble. It sounds appropriately respectful, of divine mystery, but it is logically the most problematic answer of all. Because if God is beyond definition, if no properties can be assigned to God that would allow us to distinguish a universe with God from a universe without God, then the word God is not pointing at anything. It is a word without a referent. Let me use an analogy I like. Suppose I tell you that there exists somewhere in the universe an entity called a Blorg. The Blorg has no mass, no energy, no spatial extent, no temporal dimension, no causal power to affect anything. It cannot be detected by any instrument. It leaves no trace of any kind. Its presence is indistinguishable from its absence. Does the Blorg exist? The question is genuinely meaningless. Not because the answer is no, because the question has no answer. A thing defined entirely by its undetectability is not a thing. It is the word thing applied to nothing. Now, the sophisticated theological defense of God, the God of the philosophers, the God who is described as pure being, as the ground of existence, as beyond all predication, the God I want to suggest to you has exactly the same problem as the Blorg. If God has no properties that differentiate his presence from his absence, if any possible universe, however full of suffering and silence and unanswered prayer, is equally consistent with God existing and not existing, then we are not choosing between two different hypotheses. We are arguing about the definition of a word. And arguments about the definition of a word are not arguments about reality. They're arguments about language. That's the first problem, and it's already serious enough to require a response, but let's keep going. But here's what we do know. In the human case, in the case of a mind interacting with matter, there is always a physical substrate, neurons, electrochemical signals. The mind, whatever it ultimately is associated with physical processes that we can detect and measure. The God who answers prayers has no physical substrate. No neurons, no energy, no spatial location. And yet somehow, through a mechanism that is never specified, this mind with no physical properties alters the state of the physical world in response to words spoken or thought by human beings. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I genuinely cannot construct a coherent mechanism for it. Not because I haven't tried, because every mechanism I can imagine either requires God to have physical properties, in which case God becomes part of the natural world and subject to natural investigation, or requires an interaction that violates what we understand about how physical systems work. Neither option is comfortable for theology. The first turns God into something science can eventually study and either find or not find. The second requires us to accept that our understanding of physics, the most precisely tested and verified body of knowledge our species has ever produced, is wrong in a domain that conveniently cannot be tested. That is not a position I am able to defend with a straight face. Look, I've been sitting with these problems for a long time, and I want to be honest with you. Problems 1 and 2 were the ones I thought I could find a way around. I kept trying. Problems 3 and 4 are the ones where I stopped trying. Subscribe if you want to see where this goes. Back in 30 seconds. This is the one that I find most elegant. And by elegant, I mean the kind of clean that a really good proof has, where the result seems almost too neat, and then you check it again and it's correct. The most common argument for God's existence, the one that has been made in every culture and every century, is the argument from complexity. Look at the universe, look at living things, look at the extraordinary, improbable, intricately organized structure of it all. Something this complex must have been designed. Design requires a designer, therefore God. Now, I understand why this argument is compelling, I really do. When you look at a protein, when you understand how a single enzyme works, how it folds into exactly the right three-dimensional shape to catalyze exactly the right chemical reaction, it does look, for a moment, like something planned, something intended. But here's the problem with the argument from complexity, and it is a problem that I find genuinely devastating. God, as described, is more complex than anything God supposedly created. Follow this carefully because it matters. The claim is that complex things require a designer. Okay, the universe is complex. Therefore, it requires a designer, God. But what is God? God is described as omniscient, knowing everything, containing complete information about every state of every particle in the universe throughout all of time. God is omnipotent, capable of any action, holding every possible causal power. God is omnipresent, existing everywhere with awareness extending across all of space. The information content alone of an omniscient God, the sheer quantity of data required to constitute a mind that knows everything, is vastly greater than the information content of the universe that God supposedly created. So, by the logic of the argument from complexity, God requires a designer of even greater complexity. And that designer requires a designer, and so on forever. The argument from complexity, if it proves anything, proves that the designer of the universe must itself be designed, which means you haven't explained anything. You just pushed the explanation one step back and made the thing you have to explain bigger and more complicated than what you started with. Darwin understood this, by the way, not just as a point about biology, as a general logical principle. Any explanation that invokes a more complex entity to explain a less complex entity is not an explanation. It is a more elaborate version of the original puzzle. The only way the complexity argument works is if you exempt God from it. If you say God is complex, but God is the kind of thing that doesn't require explanation. But the moment you do that, you have abandoned the argument that got you to God in the first place. You have accepted that some things of great complexity can exist without a designer. And if that's true, if complexity does not, after all, require design, then the universe doesn't need a designer either. You can't have it both ways. Either complexity always requires explanation, in which case God requires one too, and you have infinite regress. Or complexity sometimes doesn't require explanation, in which case the argument for God from complexity fails. There's no third option. I've looked for a long time. There is no third option. This is the one I want to spend the most time on, because it's the one that I think goes deepest into what the word God is actually supposed to mean, and it's the one that leads somewhere I did not expect. One of the core properties attributed to God, maybe the most fundamental one, the one that underlies everything else, is omniscience. God knows everything, past, present, future. Every thought, every event, every quantum state of every particle in the universe. I want to think about what that actually means, not whether it's possible, what it means. To know the future, to genuinely, completely know what will happen, you need one of two things. Either the future is determined, completely, absolutely determined by the present state of the universe with no genuine randomness anywhere. Every event is the inevitable result of prior causes and a sufficiently powerful intelligence that knew the complete present state of everything could calculate, in principle, every future state. This is the clockwork universe, Laplace's demon, the fully deterministic world. Or the future contains genuine randomness, events that are not determined by prior causes but arise spontaneously, as quantum mechanics tells us they do, and God somehow knows the outcome of those random events in advance. Let's take the first option, the deterministic universe. The problem here is that determinism and free will are incompatible. If every future event, including every thought, every decision, every action of every human being, is already determined by prior causes, then human choice is an illusion. What feels like deciding is actually just the predetermined unfolding of a causal chain that was fixed at the beginning of the universe. If that's true, then moral judgment becomes incoherent. You cannot be held responsible for an action you had no alternative but to perform. And a God who created a deterministic universe and then judges its inhabitants for the predetermined behavior of that universe is, to put it plainly, holding a trial where the verdict was written before the accused was born. That is not justice. That is theater. Now let's take the second option. God knows the future, including the outcomes of genuinely random quantum events. The quantum mechanics tells us that these outcomes are not determined, They are genuinely random, not just unknown, but unknowable in principle, even in theory. The uncertainty is not a feature of our ignorance, it is a feature of reality. If God knows the outcome of a genuinely random event before it occurs, then one of two things is true. Either the event is not genuinely random, it is determined by something we haven't found yet, which brings us back to the first option and all its problems. Or knowledge of a future event is compatible with that event being genuinely undetermined, which means God's knowledge of the future somehow doesn't constrain the future, which means God's foreknowledge is not knowledge in any sense we can understand. It is something else entirely, something for which we have no concept. And here is where I have to stop and be honest. I have been doing physics my whole professional life. I have gotten pretty comfortable with things that seem paradoxical, with particles that are in two places at once, with time that runs differently depending on how fast you're moving, with an uncertainty principle that says the universe has fundamental limits on what can be known simultaneously. I can live with paradox, I genuinely can. But the omniscience problem is not a paradox. A paradox has a resolution, usually a resolution that requires you to update your intuitions about what the words mean. The omniscience problem, when you work through it carefully, does not have a resolution. It has a dissolution. The concept turns out not to be coherent when examined at the level of detail it requires. Not paradoxical, incoherent. There is a difference, a very important one. I want to tell you something about how I feel about all of this, because I think the emotional dimension matters and scientists don't talk about it enough. When I was working through these problems, really working through them, not just listing them, but sitting with them and trying every angle I could think of, there was a period where I genuinely wanted to find the error in my own reasoning. Not because I had religious faith that I wanted to protect. I didn't really, not in any conventional sense. But because the alternative, accepting that the God concept, in any form that could do the theological work it's supposed to do, is logically incoherent, felt like a kind of loss. Not for me personally, for the people I love who found comfort in it, for the billions of people across history who faced terrible things and found, in the idea of a God who knew and cared, something that made the terrible things survivable. I did not want to take that away. I still don't. But I also cannot lie about what the logic shows. I can't do it. I tried and I can't. And here's what I think is actually happening, what I think has been happening for a long time, and what I think is worth saying clearly. The intuitions that give rise to religion, the sense that the universe is not indifferent, that what you do matters, that there is something worth calling sacred, those intuitions are not wrong. I don't think they're wrong. I think they're pointing at something real. But the concepts we built to house those intuitions, the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent personal God who monitors your behavior and answers your prayers, those concepts don't survive careful examination. The intuition is pointing in a real direction. The concept is the wrong map for the territory. And the tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is not that the universe has no God. It is that the concept of God we were given is not adequate to the universe we actually live in. Now, here is the thing. I said earlier that my father taught me the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing the thing itself. I want to apply that now to the question underneath the God question. What is actually there when you look? When I look as carefully as I can with everything I know, I find something that genuinely astonishes me every single time. Not a warm, fuzzy astonishment. A cold, clean, almost terrifying one. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. It contains somewhere between 2 trillion and 20 trillion galaxies. Each galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars. Each star is a nuclear reactor running for millions or billions of years. And somehow one of the smaller and less distinguished planets orbiting one of those hundreds of billions of stars, a process of molecular chemistry got going that over 4 billion years, produced organisms capable of looking back at all of this and asking what it is. That is not a religious statement. That is a physical one, and the physical statement is more extraordinary to me than any religious statement I have ever heard, because the religious statement says someone arranged all of this, which makes it in a way less astonishing, because arranged things are less surprising than things that arrange themselves. The physical statement says, given the laws of this universe, given the initial conditions, this is what happens. Galaxies form, stars burn, planets cool, chemistry begins, and eventually, not inevitably, but actually, because it actually happened, the universe produces something that can ask about itself. I find that so strange and so beautiful that I genuinely don't have better words for it. I don't know why the laws of physics are what they are. I don't know why there is something rather than nothing. I don't know whether there's something beyond what we can currently detect or describe. And I find all of that not depressing, but thrilling. Because not knowing is not the end of the inquiry, it is the beginning of it. And the beginning of an inquiry is the most exciting place to be. So here we are, 4 problems with the God concept that I genuinely tried to solve and couldn't. Not because I wasn't looking hard enough, because the problems are real. The definition problem, a God beyond all description, is not a hypothesis, it is a word. The interaction problem, a non-physical mind that physically alters the world, requires a mechanism that nobody has specified. The complexity trap, a designer more complex than the design thing requires its own explanation infinitely. The knowledge problem, omniscience, worked through carefully, is not paradoxical, it is incoherent. What do I conclude from this? Well, and here I want to be very precise. I conclude that the God described in the major theological traditions, when examined with the same rigor we would apply to any other hypothesis, does not hold together. That is different from concluding that the universe is empty of meaning, or that your experience of something larger than yourself is an illusion, or that the question underneath the God question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe have the character it has? What is the relationship between consciousness and physical reality? That those questions are not worth asking. They are absolutely worth asking. They are, to me, the most interesting questions there are. I just think the honest answer to all of them right now is, I don't know. And I want to say something about that answer, because I don't know has a bad reputation. People hear it as a defeat, as given up, is the thing you say when you have nothing real to offer. But in science, in real science, the kind that actually moves things forward, I don't know, is not the end of the conversation. It is the conversation. Every genuinely great discovery in physics began with someone being honest about not knowing something. Every closed answer, every God did it, and every it's just the way things are, every answer that tries to shut the question down, those are the ones that